In the cold, lifeless depths of space, a prison unlike any other floated in the void, hidden from the eyes of the galaxy. It was known as Black Reach, a fortress built by the XLR Dominion to contain beings too dangerous to roam free. Among the countless prisoners held within its reinforced walls, one name was whispered in fear: Nyx. She was no ordinary captive. Every being who touched her turned into ice, their bodies frozen solid, their last expressions forever trapped in horror. No species had ever survived contact with her. She was a living curse, a weapon the XLR feared, yet refused to kill. Instead, they kept her locked away in a containment cell, surrounded by energy fields that ensured no one could come near her. The guards never entered. The scientists never dared to touch her. Even the most ruthless criminals in Blackreach spoke her name only in hushed tones. But everything changed when a new prisoner arrived, a human. His name was Elias Grant, a captured officer from the Terran fleet. Unlike the others who were dragged into Blackreach kicking and screaming, Elias walked with his head held high, his sharp eyes scanning the corridors as he was forced through the prison's halls. The XLR saw him as nothing more than a minor threat, a primitive species unworthy of fear. Humans were known for their resilience, but resilience meant little in a place like this. He was thrown into the same containment zone as Nyx, a decision the guards made with cruel amusement. To them, it was a death sentence. The moment he got too close, his body would freeze, just like all the others before him. Inside the cold metallic chamber, Nyx sat against the far wall, her dark eyes watching as Elias was pushed inside. The door locked behind him with a hiss. Silence filled the room. She didn't speak. She didn't move. She had seen this play out before: another prisoner, another inevitable death. They always thought they could survive. They always thought they were different. But they were wrong. Elias studied her, noting the way her body tensed, the way she kept her hands curled into fists as if she feared her own skin. He had heard the rumors. He knew what she could do. But fear wasn't what filled his mind, it was curiosity. The XLR hadn't thrown him in with just any prisoner. They wanted to see him die. That meant she was something special. He took a cautious step forward, testing the space between them. She flinched. "Stay back," Nyx said, her voice hollow, distant. "You don't know what I am." Elias tilted his head slightly. "I know enough. You touch people, and they freeze." He glanced at the room, the cold air swirling faintly around her. "I'm guessing you don't do it on purpose." She looked away, her fingers tightening around the fabric of her sleeves. "It doesn't matter. Just don't come near me." He didn't listen. Instead, he crouched down, resting his arms on his knees, his gaze steady. "How long have you been here?" Nyx hesitated. She had lost track of time long ago. Days, months, years had all blurred together in the endless cold. "Long enough." Elias exhaled slowly. He could see the way she kept herself isolated, the way she fought to keep control. She wasn't a monster. She was afraid. But the XLR didn't keep people here out of fear alone. They kept them for a reason. And that meant she was more than just dangerous. She was valuable. The minutes stretched on. Nyx expected him to keep his distance, expected him to retreat to the far side of the room like the others before him. But then, without warning, Elias did something impossible. He reached out and placed his hand on hers. Nyx's breath caught in her throat. She waited for the familiar sensation, for the air to crackle with ice, for his body to stiffen, for his skin to turn to frozen stone. But nothing happened. The cold didn't spread. His body didn't freeze. He was completely, utterly unaffected. She yanked her hand back, staring at him in shock. "How?" Her voice barely escaped her lips. This had never happened before. Every species in the galaxy froze at her touch. Every single one except him. Elias looked down at his hand, then back at her. "Huh," he said, as if he had just discovered something mildly interesting. "Guess humans are built different." Nyx's mind raced, struggling to comprehend what had just happened. The XLR had tested her ability on countless species: warriors, assassins, prisoners. No one had ever survived. Yet this human sat in front of her, completely unharmed, as if she were nothing more than an ordinary person. The security cameras in the room blinked red, watching, recording. Somewhere, the XLRE scientists were undoubtedly losing their minds. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Nyx felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. If Elias could touch her without harm, then maybe, just maybe, she wasn't as cursed as she thought. But the XLRE wouldn't let this go unanswered. They feared her before. Now, they would fear her even more. And that meant Elias was in danger, just as much as she was. For the first time in years, Nyx wasn't thinking about how to stay away from someone. She was thinking about how to protect them. Because if the XLRI found out why Elias was immune to her power, they wouldn't just keep him locked up. They would tear him apart to find out why. The air inside the cold prison cell felt heavier than before, thick with something unspoken, something neither Nyx nor Elias could fully understand. The cameras in the corners of the room blinked red, watching, analyzing, recording every second. Somewhere in the depths of Black Reach, XLRE scientists were studying the impossible, a human who could touch the untouchable and live. Nyx sat against the wall, staring at her hands, hands that had turned warriors into frozen statues, hands that had brought death to anyone who dared come too close. But Elias had survived. Not just survived, he had touched her and walked away without a scratch. Her mind struggled to make sense of it. She had long believed she was a living weapon, a walking curse. The XLRE had kept her imprisoned for years, testing her, fearing her, ensuring no one could ever get close. And yet, Elias Grant had broken that rule without even trying. Elias, on the other hand, seemed far too calm. He sat across from her, his back against the cold metal wall, arms crossed, watching her with an expression that was more curiosity than fear. He was thinking, calculating, trying to piece together the same puzzle she was. His dark eyes flickered with something different from the others who had shared this cell before. They had all looked at her with terror, desperation, the realization that they were about to die. But Elias? He wasn't afraid. That alone made him dangerous, not just to the XLRE, but to the very foundation of what Nyx had believed about herself. "You're not going to freak out?" she finally asked, her voice quieter than she intended. Elias raised an eyebrow. "Should I? You should be dead." She clenched her fists. "You're the first person to ever touch me and survive. I don't even know how it's possible." Elias considered this for a moment before lifting his hand, staring at it like it held an answer. Then, to her shock, he reached forward again, placing his palm against hers. Nyx's breath caught in her throat. No ice. No frost. No death. The cold that usually spread like wildfire, consuming anything it touched, didn't react to him at all. Her heart pounded. This wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a trick. Elias was immune. Humans were immune. "Still not dead," Elias muttered, studying her reaction more than his own. "I'd say that's a good thing." Nyx yanked her hand away, pressing it against her chest as if trying to feel if something inside her had changed. But nothing had. The power was still there, lingering beneath her skin, waiting to be unleashed like a storm. And yet, it refused to touch him. Elias exhaled, shaking his head. "Well, looks like the XLRE are going to have a real bad day trying to explain this one." He nodded toward the cameras, which were undoubtedly feeding footage back to the control room. "I bet they're scrambling right now, trying to figure out what makes me different." Nyx felt a cold dread settle over her. He was right. The XLRE would never ignore something like this. If Elias was an anomaly, they wouldn't just lock him away like the others. They would want to know why. They would take him, experiment on him, rip him apart if it meant uncovering the secret of his immunity. "We have to get out of here," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. Elias smirked. "Now we're talking." "You don't understand," she pressed on, leaning closer. "They won't let this go. If you were just another prisoner, they would have kept you locked up like the rest. But this?" She motioned between them. "This changes everything. They will come for you, and when they do, they won't stop until they find out what makes you different." Elias ran a hand through his short, dark hair, sighing. "Yeah, I figured as much. But escaping from a high-security prison run by an alien empire isn't exactly an easy job. Got a plan? Nyx hesitated. She had never thought of escaping before. The idea had always been impossible. She was too dangerous, too well guarded. But Elias changed everything. He could touch her, help her, stand beside her without fear. For the first time, she wasn't alone. If anyone could find a way out, it was them together. Before she could answer, the sound of the cell door unlocking shattered the silence. The heavy metallic doors slid open, and a group of XLR guards entered, their weapons raised. But they weren't aiming at her. Their sharp, black eyes locked onto Elias instead. "You will come with us," one of them ordered in the guttural XLRI tongue. Elias didn't move. His body tensed, his mind already working through the situation. He knew what this was. They weren't here to take him to a normal interrogation. They wanted to know what made him different. Nyx's pulse quickened. They were taking him now. She had to do something. Before she could think, before she could even stop herself, she moved. The guards had spent years training to avoid her, staying just far enough that her deadly touch couldn't reach them. They'd always seen her as a threat, an uncontrollable force. But now, she was something worse, an uncontrollable force with a purpose. The first guard didn't even have time to react before Nyx grabbed his wrist. His body stiffened instantly, ice spreading from the point of contact, freezing him in place. The others stumbled back, fear flashing in their eyes. But they weren't fast enough. She had spent too long being afraid of herself. Now, she was using her curse as a weapon. Elias wasted no time. He lunged at the nearest guard, grabbing his weapon and slamming the butt of it into the alien's skull. The XLR crumpled to the ground. The remaining guards hesitated, their training failing them in the face of something they couldn't understand: a human and a cursed prisoner fighting together. Nyx turned to Elias, her breath unsteady. "We need to move. Now." Elias grinned. "I was hoping you'd say that." They stepped over the frozen bodies and bolted into the corridor. Alarms blared. The hunt had begun. But this time, Nyx wasn't running alone. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of what she was. She was ready to fight. The blaring of alarms echoed through the metal corridors of Black Reach, red lights flashing in a frantic rhythm, signaling what no XLR had ever expected: a breakout was happening. Nyx and Elias sprinted through the dimly lit passageways, their footsteps a sharp contrast to the chaos unfolding around them. The prison had gone into full lockdown. Heavy blast doors slammed shut behind them, cutting off sections of the facility to contain the breach. But they weren't going to stop. They couldn't. This was their only chance. Elias gripped the stolen plasma rifle in his hands, scanning the branching corridors ahead. He had never been inside a XLR prison before, but he had studied enough military layouts to know that a facility like this had one major weakness: overconfidence. The XLR thought no one could escape. That meant security was designed to keep prisoners in, not to stop them from navigating the complex. And if there was a way in, there was always a way out. He glanced at Nyx, who was keeping pace beside him, her dark eyes flicking between possible routes. Despite the adrenaline rushing through her veins, she looked steady, determined. For the first time in years, she had something to fight for. Ahead of them, a squad of XLR guards rounded the corner, weapons raised. The aliens barked orders in their guttural tongue, demanding their surrender. But Elias didn't slow down. Surrender wasn't an option. He lifted the plasma rifle and fired. The first bolt struck a guard in the chest, sending him crashing against the wall. Nyx moved with an almost unnatural speed, lunging forward before the others could react. The nearest guard hesitated, stepping back instinctively too late. Her hand brushed against his arm, and within seconds, ice spread across his body, freezing him solid. The remaining auxiliary made the mistake of focusing on her, giving Elias enough time to take them down with precise shots. Within moments, the path was clear. Nyx exhaled, glancing at the frozen corpse at her feet. She had spent years fearing her own power, isolating herself, letting the XLR keep her locked away like a weapon they didn't know how to control. But now, for the first time, she was using it for herself. She turned to Elias. "We need to find the hangar." If there's a ship, we take it. Elias nodded. Agreed. But we need to reach the control center first. If they still have access to the security systems, they'll lock down any exit before we even get close. Nyx clenched her fists. He was right. Even if they reached the hangar, the XLR could override the docking clamps remotely, trapping them inside until reinforcements arrive. They had minutes at best before the Dominion sent a fleet to secure the prison. They had to move now. They sprinted down another hallway, the air filled with the distant echoes of approaching guards. Elias led the way, following his instincts. The control center had to be near the core of the facility. As they turned a corner, they found themselves face to face with another set of guards, but these were different, heavily armored elite forces. The Acceleri had stopped underestimating them. They were taking this seriously. The first elite soldier fired, his plasma bolt narrowly missing Elias as he ducked behind cover. Nyx moved before she could think. The moment a guard stepped too close, she reached out, brushing her fingers against his exposed neck. Ice surged from her fingertips, spreading over his body faster than before. She was adapting, learning to control the speed of her power. The other soldiers hesitated, adjusting their tactics. They knew what she could do. They wouldn't make the same mistake twice. Elias took advantage of the momentary distraction, firing precise shots at the exposed joints in their armor. Two went down before the others could react. One of the remaining guards lunged forward, swinging a blade toward Elias. Nyx moved without hesitation, stepping between them, her hand slamming against the soldier's wrist. Ice crawled up his arm in an instant, consuming him before he could even scream. Elias kicked the frozen corpse aside, gripping his rifle. "You're getting faster." Nyx swallowed, nodding. "I have to be." The last guard collapsed, and silence filled the hallway. They didn't have time to waste. They pushed forward, running deeper into the heart of the facility. After a few more turns, they found the control center. A massive door stood between them and their only chance of escape. Elias studied the panel beside it, fingers flying across the alien interface. He had learned enough about XLR technology to know their systems weren't built for speed. They prioritized security over efficiency. That meant there was always a delay, a small window of opportunity. Nyx stood guard as he worked, her body tense. The alarms were still wailing, and the sound of approaching footsteps was getting louder. They were running out of time. "Got it," Elias said, the door hissing open. They rushed inside, sealing it behind them. The room was lined with monitors, displaying various parts of the prison guards mobilizing, ships arriving in the distance, their window growing smaller by the second. Elias moved quickly, overriding security protocols, disabling lockdown measures. He located the hangar bay and disengaged the docking clamps. "We have one ship ready for launch," he said, his voice steady despite the urgency. "We need to move, now." Nyx turned toward the exit. "Then let's go." They sprinted back into the corridors, taking the fastest route toward the hangar. The prison was in chaos now, guards fighting to regain control, alarms screaming in protest, the entire facility teetering on the edge of collapse. As they reached the hangar, they saw a sleek XLR transport, small but fast. The perfect escape vessel. The doors were open, the engines humming softly. It was now or never. A squad of soldiers blocked their path, weapons raised. But Nyx and Elias didn't stop. They moved as one, Elias firing precise shots, Nyx using her power with newfound control. The XLR had always feared her. Now they had a reason to. Within seconds, the path was clear. They ran up the ramp, Elias immediately taking the controls. The ship roared to life, lifting off as the hangar doors opened. As they shot out into the vast darkness of space, Nyx looked back at the prison, the place that had held her for so long, the place that had defined her existence. But she wasn't a prisoner anymore. She was free. The cold void of space stretched endlessly beyond the viewport, stars blinking like distant memories, indifferent to the chaos unfolding within the stolen auxiliary transport. Nyx sat in the co-pilot's chair, her hands clenched into fists as she tried to steady her breath. The truth was clawing at the edges of her mind, a terrible, creeping realization that she had spent years ignoring. She had always known something was wrong with her power. But now, she was ready to face it. Elias sat beside her, his hands moving across the controls with practiced ease. He had flown stolen ships before, but never with this much urgency. The Exilari fleet would come for them soon. They had barely managed to escape Black Reach, and the Dominion never let prisoners go without a fight. Still, his mind wasn't on the ship, or the chase, or even the war. It was on her. The way Nyx had used her power, how it had grown stronger, more controlled. How, despite everything, she was still afraid not of the Exilari, but of herself. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "I wasn't born like this." Elias glanced at her. "What do you mean?" She exhaled, her fingers twitching slightly. This curse. My power. I didn't always have it." Her gaze was locked on the stars, her mind lost in the past. "I was normal once. Just like you." Elias leaned back, listening. He had suspected as much. People weren't just born with the ability to freeze anything they touched, to turn living beings into frozen statues in seconds. The Exilari had called her a weapon, but weapons were made, not born. Nyx closed her eyes, forcing herself to remember. "I was taken when I was a child. I don't remember my home, my family, just the experiments." Her voice turned cold, distant. "The Exilari weren't just keeping me locked up. They created me." Elias felt a chill crawl up his spine. He had seen what the Exilari were capable of. Their obsession with genetic manipulation, their desire to craft the perfect soldiers, the perfect weapons. "You're saying they experimented on you?" She nodded. "They wanted something that could destroy without weapons, something that couldn't be stopped. I was just one of many. But I was the only one who survived." Her fingers pressed harder into the armrests. "The others. They didn't make it. The experiments killed them. Or worse." Elias didn't ask what worse meant. He had a feeling he didn't want to know. "And you never remembered where you came from?" "No." She opened her eyes, and for the first time, he saw something different in them. Not just fear. Guilt. "But I remember them. The others. The ones who died because of me." Elias frowned. "Because of you?" "Nyx, none of this was your fault." She shook her head. "You don't understand. I was the only success. They called me Project Zero. I was different from the others. Stronger. More stable. And they wanted to know why." She swallowed hard. "So they kept testing. Kept pushing me. And when they finally realized what I was, they were afraid." Elias watched her carefully. "Afraid of what?" Nyx hesitated, her nails digging into the metal of the chair. "Afraid that I wasn't their creation. Afraid that something else made me this way." Elias stiffened. "Something else?" She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "What if the Exilari didn't give me this power? What if I already had it and they just woke it up?" A heavy silence filled the cockpit. The thought sent a shiver through Elias that had nothing to do with the cold. If Nyx's power wasn't the result of Exilari experimentation, then where had it come from? Before he could say anything, the ship's alarm blared. "Incoming vessels." Elias cursed, turning back to the controls. The sensors lit up 3 Exilari warships, closing in fast. Nyx straightened. "They found us." "Of course they did." Elias's hands flew across the console. "They're hailing us." Nyx's jaw tightened. "Don't answer." Elias didn't plan to. Instead, he diverted power to the engines, pushing the stolen transport to its limits. The ship rumbled as it surged forward, weaving through an asteroid field in a desperate attempt to escape. But the Exilari were prepared. The lead warship fired, a plasma bolt slicing through the darkness, barely missing them. "They're not playing around," Elias muttered. Nyx's mind raced. They couldn't outrun them forever. The transport wasn't made for combat. They needed another way out. And then an idea formed. A reckless, dangerous, impossible idea. She turned to Elias. "I can stop them." He frowned. "How?" She didn't answer. Instead, she unstrapped herself and moved toward the airlock. Elias's heart nearly stopped. "Nix, what are you doing?" She placed a hand against the metal door, her body tense. "I need to know if my power is really mine. If I can control it, if it's not just something the Exalari did to me." She looked over her shoulder at him, her expression calm despite the chaos. "I think I can freeze them." Elias's stomach twisted. "Nix, that's suicide." She gave him a small, sad smile. "Maybe. But if I don't do this, we both die anyway." He wanted to stop her, wanted to tell her there had to be another way. But deep down, he knew there wasn't. Nix closed her eyes, focusing. She felt the cold stir within her, but this time, she didn't resist it. She embraced it. And then, she stepped into the airlock. The door sealed behind her. Outside, the Exalari warships loomed closer. Plasma turrets charged, ready to fire. But then everything changed. A wave of frost erupted from Nix's body, spreading outward like a living storm. The vacuum of space carried no sound, but the warships trembled as ice crept over their hulls, engines freezing mid-flight. The impossible was happening. Elias watched in stunned silence as the warships stopped moving. Their weapons froze. Their systems shut down. Within moments, they were nothing more than drifting tombs. Nix collapsed inside the airlock, gasping. Elias rushed to her side, catching her before she fell. She was alive, but something was different. She looked up at him, eyes glowing faintly with a cold, unnatural light. "It's mine," she whispered. The power, it was always mine. And for the first time in her life, she wasn't afraid of it. The sky burned red as the last of the enemy warships fell from the heavens, crashing into the ruined cities below. Smoke and fire painted the horizon, but for the first time in centuries, there was silence. No more alarms. No more screams. No more desperate cries for help. The war was over. Humanity had won. Commander Elias Voss stood at the edge of the battlefield, his breath heavy as he watched the destruction unfold. The once mighty Dominion, the alien empire that had ruled over countless worlds, was no more. Their capital lay in ruins, their armies shattered, their fleets reduced to burning wreckage. The final battle had been brutal, but humanity had refused to break. They had fought with everything they had, with every ounce of strength, intelligence, and resilience that had carried them through the darkest times. And now, as the dust settled, a new dawn had begun. Nix stepped beside him, her black armor scorched, her pulse rifle still clutched in her hands. Her silver eyes scanned the ruins, searching for any sign of movement. The Dominion were known for their tricks, their last-minute surprises. Even in defeat, they were dangerous. But there was no movement, no last desperate attack. Just silence. She exhaled slowly, the tension in her muscles finally easing. "It's over," she said, almost as if she couldn't believe it herself. Elias didn't respond immediately. His mind was still processing everything. The war had defined them for so long. What came next? He had spent years fighting, watching friends die, carrying the weight of impossible decisions. Now, with victory in their grasp, the future felt uncertain. He turned to Nix, searching for answers in her expression, but she seemed just as lost. "We did it," he finally said, more to himself than to her. "We actually did it." From the remains of the battlefield, the survivors emerged. Soldiers, wounded but alive. Civilians, stepping cautiously from the underground shelters where they had hidden for so long. Humanity had endured. They had survived the worst the Dominion had thrown at them, and now they were free. But victory came at a cost. Cities had been destroyed. Entire colonies lost. Millions would never see this new dawn. Elias clenched his fists. They had won the war, but now came the hardest part: rebuilding. A transmission crackled through his communicator. "Commander Voss, this is Admiral Kane. Report. The battlefield is secure. No signs of remaining hostiles. The Dominion has fallen." There was a long pause on the other end before the Admiral finally spoke. "Understood. Begin preparations for reconstruction." We have a lot of work ahead of us. Elias glanced at Nyx, knowing she was thinking the same thing. The fight wasn't over, not really. They had to rebuild a broken world, restore what had been lost, and ensure that humanity never found itself on the edge of extinction again. As the sun rose over the battlefield, casting golden light over the ruins, Elias made a silent promise. They would honor the fallen, they would rebuild stronger, and they would never forget the price they had paid. This was not just the end of a war. It was the beginning of something greater. A new dawn had arrived,